Tonight I'm going to talk for a few moments on the theory of evolution, modern scientific theory, and the Bible. And that's an enormous subject, but one which we can only hope to scratch the surface of. And I should just make a point in my defence that I am by training a professional chemist. And when I say chemist, I don't mean pharmacist, I mean someone that studied chemistry. So I feel perhaps more privileged than most to understand a bit about what we're going to talk about this evening. So, did everything happen by chance? Well, we all think of evolution as having been thought up by Charles Darwin about 150 years ago. But in actual fact, the ideas that he put forward were voiced by the Greeks in the 5th century BC. There seems to be a need in some men and women to find a, quote, more rational explanation than that given by the Holy Scriptures, which, incidentally, have never, ever been disproved in any way, shape or form. The book of Genesis tells us quite clearly, and we've just read it, that God is the Creator. And the rest of the Bible reiterates this message time and time again. In fact, we could spend a lot of time this afternoon simply reading passages which talk about God's work as the Creator and the sustainer of all things, but time is against us. So, returning to the ancient Greeks for a moment, Plato is recorded as saying, "You gentlemen are mistaken, man did not evolve from the beast, but man began equal with the gods." Now, Plato could just as easily have been talking to modern-day philosophers such as Haeckel, who believed in the non-miraculous origin and progress of the universe. So, let's have a quick look at The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Throughout the text are phrases such as probably, might, may perhaps, or even I can form no decided opinion, I am doubtfully inclined to believe, and it is also necessary to assume. Just checking it works, because I can't see that. I can only see this one. So here are a few examples. In the introduction he says, "Make due allowance for our profound ignorance." And in chapter 1, the origin of most of our domestic animals will probably forever remain unknown. And in chapter 4, as we have no facts to guide us, speculation on the subject is almost useless. So he's not actually speaking with any conviction when he makes these various statements. If you compare that to the Bible, on the contrary, we see phrases such as, "Thus saith the Lord," and "Verily I say unto you." "Thus saith the Lord" occurs 416 times in the Authorised Version, and that's only counting the times that those four words occur together. "Verily I say unto you" occurs 68 times. So whereas the treatise that is now taught as fact in our schools and colleges is actually littered with uncertainty, our Holy Scriptures, on the other hand, which are by most people regarded today as little more than a collection of myths and fables, are punctuated with phrases affirming and confirming the truth and certainty. So what does evolution say about the origin of life? In fairness, I should point out that it does not suggest that we evolved from chimpanzees. What it says is that everything, be it plant, animal, microbe, single-cell species, all have a common ancestor, and that we simply split off from the chimpanzees and the monkeys relatively recently. All life, so the theory goes, originated from the proverbial primeval soup. Some species developed in one way, some in others, some advanced more and some advanced less. And by allowing ourselves the luxury of billions of years for this to take place, we arrive at the modern rich diversity of living species in the world today. In essence, what evolution is saying is that order is created out of chaos. And this actually flies in the face of all thermodynamics, which is the science of energy and change. Now, it's going to get all sciencey now, so bear with me. there are three laws of thermodynamics. In the first law, energy or matter cannot be created or destroyed. In other words, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You can't create something out of nothing. You can rearrange it, but you've always got what you always had. The second law is the entropy of an isolated system always increases. Now, entropy is a scientific word meaning, quite simply, disorder. So any given situation left to itself, i.e. isolated, will always become more untidy, more disordered, if you like. I mean, if you consider Bethany's bedroom, she's a teenage girl. Susan can have it absolutely spotless, but within 5 minutes it's completely disordered again. Another example could be a jar of coffee and sugar, or better still, 2 jars of coffee and sugar. In the first jar you've got the coffee sitting nicely at the bottom in a uniform layer with the sugar resting on top, and in the second you've got the 2 solids randomly mixed up together, and if both jars are then shaken they will both end up completely randomised and disordered, and there's no way that either of those jars will end up with the coffee and the sugar separated out perfectly, not without the serious input of some work or energy. The third law of thermodynamics is the entropy or the disorderliness of a perfect crystal at absolute zero is zero. So what it's saying in layman's terms is that the only way to have no disorder is to have nothing at all. Because if something exists, it possesses energy, and if it possesses energy, it must contain disorder or entropy. So absolutely nothing is perfectly ordered. Even in a perfect crystal, the atoms within the lattice are still oscillating, which means there's still amount of energy and there's still amount of disorder there. So at this stage it might be a good idea to be a bit more precise with our definitions. The system is the situation under study, the snowflake or the crystal, for example. And the surroundings are literally that, everything else. So whatever is not part of the snowflake or the crystal is part of the surroundings. So that means then that the whole universe is composed of 2 portions. It's either the system or it's the surroundings. So, in the face of these 3 laws that we've just looked at, which are demonstrated over and over and over again in scientific experiments, evolutionists want us to believe that everything, just sort of happened. But what about crystals, snowflakes, and other examples of situations where order appears to increase? As we've mentioned before, for a system to become more ordered, you need to put energy in. And if a situation becomes more ordered spontaneously, i.e. without any external intervention, then we're using up energy, leaving the surroundings in a more disordered state. So the crystal is more ordered, but the surroundings are less so. On the screen we've got a salt crystal, sodium chloride, that you put on your chips. It's formed by the evaporation of a solution of sodium chloride, and in the solution the salt exists as it does on the left, as sodium and chlorine entities, or to give it their scientific title, iron, which are surrounded by molecules of water. And this is what happens when you dissolve something in water. Now you need to put energy in to drive the water off and to allow it to evaporate. And it is true that the crystals so formed are much more ordered than the sodium and chlorines were. So put my teeth back in. The crystal is much more ordered than the discrete sodium and chlorine ions that were floating about in the water. But the surroundings of the crystal have now become more disordered. So although the sodium and the chloride ions themselves have become less disordered, the surroundings themselves have become more disordered. And we've had to put energy in to do that. So let's think now about life or biological existence. All life requires energy to carry out its various functions, whether it's moving muscles, to pump blood around, for metabolism, all that sort of thing. And there's that entropy concept again. Throughout the natural world, whether it's plant or animal, energy is derived from a very simple sugar called glucose. And the energy is obtained by converting or oxidising the glucose into carbon dioxide and water. This process is called oxidation, and it always involves the release of energy to the surroundings. Combustion is a special case of oxidation, and that's why fires keep us warm. In nature, the process by which energy is derived from sugar is called respiration. And in any ordinary chemical oxidation, heat is either lost completely to the surroundings or can be partially harnessed to do work. And the more of that energy that is harnessed and the less that is lost, the better, the more efficient the system is. And respiration stores this energy chemically in a manner that is vastly more efficient than anything that man has ever come up with. And I believe the figure of 70% efficiency is there or thereabouts, but don't quote me on the exact figure. Nature stores its energy inside a remarkable molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Converting glucose into carbon dioxide and water is a complex operation involving some 20 steps. Whenever a step produces energy, it's stored in one of these ATP molecules. And each one of these steps requires specific conditions and specific chemicals to be present. And these chemicals are called enzymes and coenzymes, themselves complex three-dimensional protein molecules. Now, some authorities say that a minimum of 40 of these are required. Others put the figure nearer to 200. But if any one of these enzymes or any one of these coenzymes is missing, the whole multi-stage process grinds to a halt. If any one of the many atoms within any one of those structures is missing, or it's in the wrong place, or it's in the wrong orientation even, i.e. it's facing the wrong way in the molecule, the whole thing just falls apart. Also, most biochemicals, as they're called, are relatively unstable, and they don't stay around for long. So, despite its absolutely incredible complexity, there is no evidence whatsoever that respiration could have developed or evolved. It simply couldn't happen. Partially evolved respiration just wouldn't work. As we've just seen, if you change one of those molecules, the whole thing stops. It grinds to a halt. So it must have been the way it is now. It can't have changed. So we've got to have exactly the right set of chemicals in exactly the right set of circumstances for respiration to take place. And all this within the confines of a microscopic cell. So, I'm going to play devil's advocate briefly now. If, let's say, by chance we get all the right chemicals in all the right place at the right time, the cell could still not utilise the glucose because in our multi-stage process, the first 6 steps actually use up energy. So you've got to do 6 reactions first before you get any payback and before there is an excess of ATP. So in other words, it just cannot happen due to pure thermodynamics. There's got to be something else going on. And as we look closer and closer at nature with more and more precision, we can see more and more and more evidence that it simply could not have happened by chance, which is the subject we're looking at this evening. So, hopefully I've convinced you. Hopefully you're all still awake. What does the Bible have to say on this subject? Well, we've already had a look at Genesis chapter 1, which is the biblical account of creation. Reading verses 1 and 2 again, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Again, time is against us, but if you read through the whole of the biblical account of creation, which actually we've just done, it's logical, and it's in the correct sequence, and there's none of these wild embellishments that are typical of man's myths and legends. It is totally in accordance with modern scientific understanding. There's an argument that's often put forward that the timescales are wrong. And if the scriptural account is to be believed, then the universe is only a few thousand years old. Well, if you go back to the original Hebrew, the language does not state that at all. When it says day, it's talking about time period. So it could be a day, an hour, a month, millennia. The creation in Genesis is completely in agreement with all the scientific facts that have been discovered so far, and indeed ever will be discovered in the future. There is no inconsistency whatsoever in the fact that there is physical evidence that the universe is millions of years old, which is a subject in itself, and I'm not going to pursue it tonight. Consider another verse from the scriptures, Jeremiah's prophecy, chapter 32, verse 17. Our Lord God, you have made the heaven and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you. And then we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the book of Job, because there's a conversation between Job and the Almighty, and I just want to pick out little bits from there and just use those as examples. First one I want to look at is Job 38. And this is coming in at verse 4. And this is God the Almighty talking to Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste, and cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Chapter 39. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly. Again, this is God talking. But are her wings and pinions like the kindly storks? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Her labour is in vain, without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. Have you given the horse strength? This is verse 19. Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and stronghold. From there it spies out the prey that eyes observe from afar. So here in these closing chapters of Job, we see so much natural history. Knowledge that I suggest that at that time, man had no way of knowing. And it's widely believed that Job was contemporary with Abraham. So he's about 4,000 years ago. Chapter 41. Again, this is God speaking. Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. Chapter 42. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. So where does that leave us then? As I see it, we've got two options, and only two options. We either put our faith in mankind and so-called science, or we put our trust in God. And it's very true that mankind has progressed massively in knowledge and discovery over the years, particularly in recent times. But there are still experiments performed which quite literally turn science upside down. And one of these was the Ultraviolet Catastrophe. I think you're a physicist, aren't you? By training. So this will be all old hat to you. I've lost my place. The ultraviolet catastrophe occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. Classical physics made various predictions about how energy is emitted from an object. but the experiments showed that these conclusions were completely wrong, and it took the advent of quantum physics to explain the phenomenon. Now, for all it is very advanced and rigorously mathematical, quantum physics and classical physics, i.e. Sir Isaac Newton et al., are diametrically opposed on many issues. Quantum physics works extremely well at the atomic and subatomic level, but it doesn't work in everyday scales. On the other hand, Newtonian physics works very well on the large scale, but it falls down at the molecular. So for all our advances, we still haven't got the explanation for everything. And the point that I'm trying to make is that man's knowledge is only as good as the latest experiment or the latest theory. Tomorrow somebody else could come across something that will force us to completely re-evaluate our understanding of the world in which we live. Now, the Lord God Almighty is exactly that. This is a prayer of Moses, who gave the law, God's law, to the Israelites. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Psalm 93, which talks about the eternal reign of the Almighty God. The Lord reigns, he is clothed with majesty. The Lord is clothed, he has girded himself with strength. Surely the world is established so that it cannot be moved. Your throne is established from of old, you are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, than the mighty waves of the sea. Your testimonies are very sure. Holiness adorns your house, O Lord, forever. So, in conclusion then, we have seen how complex and how beautiful science is, and I consider myself very, very privileged that as a chemist, I can see patterns and beauty in stuff that most people don't even know is there. The way that the atoms behave, the way the molecules behave, it's just, to me, it's just wonderful. We haven't even had time to discuss the Venus flytrap, which is one of the carnivorous plants, which, like respiration, it simply cannot have evolved. There are two triggers that are needed to make the plant close up, and it just couldn't have half evolved. It either had to be like that from the beginning, or it wouldn't have happened at all. And on the other hand, we have looked at the Holy Scriptures, albeit a glancing, very quick whistle-stop, which do offer a very rational and a very logical explanation. So, I'm going to leave you with the question that we started with. Did everything happen by chance? I suggest not. Thank you.